and today we're going to do the case Texas Oil. This case is really good at illustrating how to use various graphs and maps, as well as how to analyze profit given various corporate objectives. I will be the interviewee for today's case.
And I'm Philip, and I will be the interviewer. All right, so let's hop right into the case.
Okay.
Your client, Texas Oil, is a large integrated oil and gas company which competes with the likes of ExxonMobil, Shell, and Chevron. They have assets in 72 countries on 5 continents and own 1/4 of the U.S. oil market. They recently purchased a large area of land from a small independent oil company and are attempting to integrate it into their portfolio in West Texas. They hired your firm to help them determine how to develop the purchased land. While the company is large, it is also capital constrained. This is because of low crude oil prices and an over-budget refinery in Angola. As a result, the company cannot develop all of the purchased land in the coming years. How would you frame this problem for the client?
Great. So just to recap what I heard, our client is Texas Oil. They're an integrated oil and gas company, and they compete with the likes of Exxon and Shell. They're a global company. They have about 1/4 of the U.S. market. They recently purchased land, which they're hoping to integrate into their West Texas portfolio. They brought us in to understand how they should develop the land because they are capital constrained, so that will be an important thing for us to keep in mind as we move forward. Did I get everything?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, great. And may I ask one clarifying question?
Sure.
The land that they purchased, can we assume that it is all fully capable of being developed and that there are reserves there?
Yeah, so all of the purchased land does have proven oil and gas reserves,
Okay.
And that's with about 90% confidence.
Great, thank you. May I have a few moments to get my thoughts together?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so the question at hand is how can Texas Oil develop the land that they purchased? And so I really thought about this as kind of how they're going to prioritize. And in terms of prioritization, I really looked at the overall profit that they can get from each location, or effectively the net present value that each location will bring in. And so breaking that down, I looked at the 2 different components that would drive profit, so revenue and cost. With revenue, I want to understand things like the yield per acre. Additionally, I want to understand the quality or pricing differential. So I know that oil is a commodity, but if, for instance, there is any different types of oil that might drive different pricing per region, then I would want to understand that. Additionally, I would want to understand cost. So switching gears to the cost side, I would want to understand the fixed cost and the variable. So underneath fixed cost, I would want to understand things like the cost to develop the specific land. Additionally, I would want to understand any additional equipment cost. And so I think that as we think about how much it will cost to develop, I would also want to consider things like where else do we have locations, and could that potentially reduce the cost through synergies that we would see in developing nearby land. Additionally, I would want to understand the variable costs that we would see with each location, including labor cost and processing.
Great. All right, so the land on which the drilling rights were purchased is owned by the government and leased to companies on a 5-year timeline. If a leaseholder does not develop that land in that time, the lease expires and the leaseholder can no longer develop it. Texas Oil's purchased land has only 3 years remaining on its current lease agreement. How many acres can Texas Oil develop before their lease expires, and what percentage of their land would that represent?
Okay. So given that we're trying to understand how much they can develop before the lease expires, I want to understand, do we have any information on how much land they're able to develop per year based on historical data?
Yeah, so historically the company has been able to develop land at a rate of 100 square miles per year.
100 square miles per year. Okay, and since we are looking for the land in acres, do we have a conversion rate for square miles to square acres?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. 640 acres is equivalent to 1 square mile.
1 square mile, okay. And then additionally, we want to understand the percent that they're able to develop Do we have any information on how much they purchased in total?
Yes, they've purchased 320,000 square acres.
320,000 square acres. Great. So to start, I'm going to determine how much land they're able to develop per year in square miles. So we know that there's 3 years remaining on the lease. I'm going to take that times our 100 square miles per year. So we know that per year they're able to develop 300 square miles. And then now I'm going to convert that back to acres. So if they're able to convert 300 square miles, and to multiply that times the 640 acres that make up 1 square mile. And I'm going to get out a piece of scratch paper for that. And I'm going to do the 64 times 3. So that's going to give us 192,000 square acres that they're able to develop. And that answers our first question. However, the client wants to understand what % of their total purchases that would be. And so with that, we'll take the 192,000 square acres and we'll divide that by their total purchase, which is 320,000 square acres.
Okay.
And that is going to get us to a percentage of 60%. So as it stands right now, the client is only able to develop 60% of the land that they have purchased, so they will have to be very strategic about how they approach that, as well as keeping in mind that initial capital constraint that the client is concerned about.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a great point. So now that we've determined that 60% number, like you said, need to prioritize.
Yep.
The company has categorized the land into 5 focus areas, each with 64,000 acres. And here on this map, you can see those 5 focus areas. How would you go about prioritizing these focus areas?
Great. So they have 64,000 acres per area. So it looks like they'll be able to develop 3 areas, given that they can develop 192,000 square miles from our previous calculations. So taking a look at this, there's a few different things that I would want to consider in determining how to prioritize it. I think that the first is going to be that NPV analysis, where we would look at the cost and revenue as we discussed in the first initial section. Additionally, I would want to consider things such as capital efficiency. So given that capital constraint is really their first priority, I would want to look at the potential trade-offs, as that initial investment might be too large to make a project feasible. Additionally, I would want to look at the balance of projects. So it could be feasible that we might have to eliminate one, again going back to that capital efficiency. And then I would also want to look at any external factors such as environmental concerns. So for instance, are there any regulations about, I see here that Coyote Tooth, Fox Path, and Nag Riverhead are all very close to each other. Perhaps there's some type of environmental constraint that would prohibit us from drilling in 3 locations that are so close. So we've got environment. And then finally, one thing that I would want to consider is that since we are only able to develop 3, it's feasible that we could potentially sell off or find some other use for the other 2. And so I would want to also consider the opportunity cost of developing versus selling off.
Each one of these areas can be developed independently, but not at the same time. The firm has provided you with exhibits 2 and 3, which I'll show you in a second, and asks you to determine its optimal course of action. So here is exhibit 2, and here is exhibit 3. So according to the head of the West Texas business unit, the company has $300 million available to spend. So how should Texas Oil develop the purchased land?
Okay. Great. So it looks like we have a few exhibits here to look at. This one over here. So it looks like exhibit 2 is going to have some important information for us. So we can see here we have each location, we have Eagle Mountain, Fox Path, Midland, Nag Riverhead, and Coyote Tooth. Going across the top, we can see the acres, which confirms the 64,000 that we heard earlier. I do see three different types of oil revenue, or three different types of revenue. So we have oil revenue, gas revenue, and NGL revenue. Can we assume that the company is equally okay with any additional or with any type of revenue as long as the total revenue is providing the NPV that they would need?
Yes.
Okay, so there's no strong preference. Great. So that's going to give us the total revenue here, and then we have our total cost, and then we have our NPV. So I'm just going to transfer these to my paper so that I can do any additional calculations that I need to do. So we've got Eagle Mountain, Fox Path, Midland, Nag, and Coyote. And then I'm just going to lift these final two columns because I think these are the two that we're really going to want to focus on, so the total cost and the NPV columns. So for Eagle Mountain, we have a total cost of 94, for Fox Path 108, for Midland 96, Nag is 150, and Coyote Tooth is 110. And again, we're working with that $300 million constraint. And then for the NPVs, we've got 45 million, 50 million, 45 million, 55, and 50. So right off the bat, it looks like if we have $300 million constraining us, most of these projects are averaging around 100 million. However, I do see off the bat that Nag is 150. So if we did do the Nag project, we would only be able to do one other project because the next cheapest project that we're seeing is 96 million. So that would basically prohibit us to only do one more, eliminating the third. Given that we would be only receiving an NPV of 55 from Nag River, while sacrificing that third NPV, which would be minimum of 45 million, I don't think it's a wise investment for us to develop Nag Riverhead. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate that one. Okay, so that leaves us with Eagle Mountain, Fox Path, Midland, and Coyote. Going off the fact that we can spend approximately $100 million per project, that leaves us with needing to pick two projects that are under 100 million and kind of picking up one of either Fox Path or Coyote to meet that $300 million constraint. So Eagle Mountain will definitely be a yes, and Midland will also be a yes. So that leaves us with Fox Path and Coyote remaining. And Fox Path cost 108 million, and we get a 50 million NPV. Coyote has $110 million cost and an NPV of also 50. So taking the balance of that, I'm going to go ahead and pick Fox Path because it does have an overall lower cost, yet yields the same NPV. So effectively, that's going to get us to a total cost of $298 million here. And then that's going to get us to an NPV of $140 million for the three projects that we picked. And then just going back to kind of look at the exhibits as a whole before I confirm that. So we've got Eagle Mountain here, we have Fox Path, and we have Midland. So not necessarily in kind of the cluster, but I would assume that any synergies that would be recognized or wouldn't be recognized would be included in this NPV. Going back to Exhibit 3, the focus area capital efficiencies, it's very much in line with what we saw in this chart, just a graphical representation. And again, confirming that while Nag Riverhead does have a larger NPV, the capital efficiency is not quite the same as the other four projects that we would be considering. So with that, I will confirm my initial recommendation, which is Eagle Mountain, Fox Path, and Midland.
Great. Would you like to go ahead and just kind of summarize and wrap up the case here?
I recommend that our client move forward with developing Eagle Mountain, Fox Path, and Midland, which will be a total cost of $298 million, keeping them within their $300 million constraint. This will yield an NPV of $140 million. There are a few risks with this strategy. The first risk would be that they are really pushing that $300 million constraint. So if anything goes over budget, there's really not a lot of flexibility there. Another major risk would be that we are only 90% confident of the oil capabilities, and so those NPVs could drastically shift if we found a surprise that there wasn't oil in one of the 3 areas that we've selected.
Great, awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, so to recap this case, let's look back at each part of the case and talk about what Morgan did to really set herself up for success. So from the beginning, when I read the initial prompt, she recapped everything back to me, all of the major details, didn't focus on kind of minor details and things, but from a high level, recapped every major thing that I said.
So I think another thing that's important in the introduction is, to the extent that you're able to add next level insights, that's definitely a good place to go ahead and start doing that and really kind of show your skills from the early stages of the case. So for instance, whenever repeating that the client was capital constrained, instead of just leaving it at that, I added the fact that because they are capital constrained, that's really an important objective that's going to have to be central to our argument moving forward, and something that we certainly keep in the back of our minds. Another important thing to do in the introduction is to ask any clarifying questions that you have. And so in this case, I asked about proven reserves, which is something that's kind of a key assumption moving forward in the case.
Moving on to the next part of the case with the framework, I think Morgan did a great job of not relying on a conventional or prefabricated framework of just profitability. She also added in the environmental concerns, something that may be key in the oil and gas industry. So again, with your frameworks, try to be flexible. Try to think about what are all of the pertinent concerns here for this industry, this company, this case. And again, try not to rely on frameworks that are already pre-built for you.
So moving forward, the next question was kind of the quant-heavy question of the case, if you will. Whenever you're doing anything quantitative, there's a few things to really keep in mind. The first is never go quiet. So continually inform your interviewer of what you're working on and how you're approaching the problem. I've seen candidates in the past get to the end of a problem, they've gone quiet, and they read out a number, and it's incorrect. And at that point, it's very hard to kind of step in and say, oh, I think you made a mistake at this part. So as much as you're able to keep your interviewer informed of what you're doing, it shows kind of that next level case prep. Additionally, if you're going to do scratch work, it's completely acceptable. I'm a very visual person and I like to write stuff down, but do all of your scratch work on a separate sheet of paper and just make sure that you're doing those calculations relatively quickly and that you become fairly sufficient at the quantitative math piece of the case.
Another thing Morgan did really well on the quantitative piece is immediately jumping into what information do I need to solve this problem. The question was about how many acres can they develop, but she was giving no other information in terms of numbers about anything with acres or anything like that. So she immediately thought, okay, maybe the historical rate of development is a good proxy for the future rate of development, so I'm going to ask what that is. So if you get a question and there's no numbers attached to it, immediately start thinking in your mind, how could I figure this out? What numbers do I need? And then ask for those numbers.
I think another important thing is that with each new prompt that you get in the case, go ahead and start a new sheet of paper. One of our alumni explained it to me as I was doing case prep, that at the end of the case, your case work paper should effectively look like a presentation deck. And so if you can think of each piece of paper as kind of one PowerPoint slide that's addressing one kind of core problem, not only does it keep your work more organized, it also at the end makes it very easy for you to find what you need to find. Another really important thing that this case enables you to do is to practice reading graphs and charts. And so with that, it's really important as soon as you get an exhibit to go ahead and start reading it out loud. There's a tendency to go quiet once you get an exhibit. However, really they're testing how you would interact with a client. So with that, you really want to engage the client, bring them into the conversation, and that really kind of involves processing the chart out loud, which is a very awkward skill and definitely takes some practice. We recommend, though, kind of reading the chart from the outside in. So once we started in this case and I was given these charts for example, Exhibit 2, kind of read the different areas that we were looking at first. So went through the 5 focus areas and then started reading across the top. And as you're reading, you can certainly kind of ask those questions and process the data. So as I was reading the oil revenue, gas revenue, and NGL revenue, asking the question, does the client have any preference, or is there any reason why we would prefer one type of revenue over another? Basically just kind of giving you a chance to understand what you're looking at before you have to start actually doing any type of quantitative analysis on it.
So at the end of the case, I asked Morgan to go ahead and summarize the case for me, and she jumped right in and said the most important thing first, which is what you want to do. She said, I recommend going into these 3 areas, and then she gave her reasons why. And after that, Morgan tacked on some risks, which is a good thing to do at the end of the case. You should do that at the end of the case, and she revisited some figures from earlier in the case, like the 90% figure, and just wanted to show that, hey, I'm making these recommendations, but they're not necessarily fail-proof. There are these risks that stand in the way and could possibly prohibit success in this recommendation. So just things to mention at the end of the case, but overall nice job summarizing the end of the case by Morgan.
Thanks, Philip.
You're welcome. So one thing you may have noticed in this case is that it was very interviewer-led, and I'll explain what I mean by that. When we went from one prompt to another, as the interviewer on my paper here, I was driving the case in terms of determining when it's time to ask the next question. And so once Morgan finished one of the prompts, I was the one to initiate the next step and ask the question. And you'll see different consulting firms use this interviewer-led style, and some prefer the interviewee-led flavor of cases. So it really just depends on the firm. But in some cases that you'll be doing and practicing, it's not really clear which one it is. Is it interviewee-led or is it interviewer? So it's not a very messy classification, but it is something to be aware of as you get cases and as you're giving cases. Just look through it and try to determine, does this have a lot of like transitions that aren't very natural for the interviewee, where we're pivoting from one topic to another? That's usually a good indication that it's interviewer-led, and you're going to have to, once the interviewee finishes one question, you're the one that drives it right into the next one.
Thank you, everybody, for watching today, and we hope that this was helpful. Good luck with recruiting in the coming year.
Good luck.